Hey, thank you everybody for attending the CDF online meetup. I am Tracy Reagan, your host for this for today's event. Before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that our next meetup is we're going to have, let me make sure I know, we're doing using the Jenkins templating engine for pipeline modeling. Steve Tarana, who wrote it, will be presenting, and it will be held on May 12th at 11 a.m. Pacific time and 2 p.m. Eastern. So be sure you jump out there in the meetup and sign up for that. Should be very interesting. If you've ever thought about declarative models or even just templating Jenkins in a new way, that will be that'll be a fun meetup to attend. Today, though, we are, I have been thinking about DORA metrics for a while, and sometimes I think DORA metrics may be getting a bit long in the tooth. And I met Chris through kind of another format for getting topics for doing talks on, and he submitted something about pipeline analytics, and I thought that is a perfect discussion for our meetup. So today, Chris Riley is going to talk about measuring DevOps success with pipeline analytics. And if you don't know who Chris is, you may have heard him before. He does run a podcast called sweetcode.io. I highly recommend you go out there and check out some of the podcasts he's done. But he's also a developer advocate. He does developer relations for Splunk. And he has sort of been a DevOps kind of DevOps enthusiast and developer relations builder over his career. So he's also works on DevSecOps Days. He's an organizer for DevSecOps Days. So you should know Chris. He is around. And I'm super happy to have you today, Chris. And on that, I am going to bow out, let you introduce yourself in a way you feel is appropriate, and go ahead and start telling us about pipeline analytics.
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, I actually like how you introduced me because I think sometimes when you read my bio that I wrote, it doesn't come off as personal, but hopefully I live up to what you mentioned. And as a matter of fact, the podcast that you mentioned, there's a really fun episode with you and I on it. And as a result of that conversation, it was just 2-second spot on pipeline analytics. It changed my mind a little bit, and I will roll that into the conversation today. So let me share my screen, and I have to do this special share portion of the screen thing because I decided this Christmas to go and get a crazy large monitor that makes my life difficult when it comes to PowerPoint. But it is a beautiful monitor, I will tell you that much.
Well, your screen's looking good right now.
Perfect. So like Tracy said, my name is Chris Riley. If at the end of this webinar, I've earned your respect, please reach out to me. You can scan that QR code. It gets all my social information, the podcasts, and I love just engaging with the community. That's my job. My job as an advocate is to make sure I understand the reality of how companies and practitioners are embracing DevOps, SRE, and modern development practices. As a result of doing that, I have picked up a really strong interest in pipeline analytics. And we definitely, on the nerd scale, we're a 10 when it comes to pipeline analytics, as well as all the other things in DevOps. But the reason I really honed into pipeline analytics is I'm kind of blown away. This isn't a standard practice yet. There isn't a Gartner quadrant for it. And it's something that we see a lot of organizations do and consider, but it's kind of an afterthought. Also, I come from a background of organization and making sense of complex systems. And that's what you're doing here. It feels like this should be a very kind of turnkey thing that you flip the pipeline analytics switch on, but it's not. I haven't seen that yet today. And arguably, I don't know if we ever will. But there is a lot of organizational challenges around being successful here. And to the point of what Tracy really made me think about a lot more. I'd always thought about it, but in the truly modern development environments where you're doing blue-green deploys and canary releases and so forth, you have even more to consider about, and it goes far beyond DORA metrics. So the first thing I have to convince you of is that your software delivery chain is an application. In many environments, this is true. You script your infrastructure. I mean, if you're embracing GetOps, you are truly treating your delivery chain as an application. It is an application whose job, whose primary function is to deliver applications. So it's very meta. I understand that. But if you make that your mindset, then it becomes fairly obvious at some point that you should be measuring it like an application. So all the things that we do for our applications in production, we should be doing for our delivery chain itself, which means, is it operable? Is it securable? And do we have something measurable, metrics, KPIs that we can learn from and complete the loop and improve our environment? And as I said earlier, I've been kind of surprised that organizations don't embrace this sooner, but I understand why. We are obsessed with deploying applications. We are obsessed with deployments. We are obsessed with what happens in production. And we cater to that. We cater to delivering value because that is what DevOps is about, mean time to value, which is one of the metrics. And as a result, we often don't think about how do we make that sustainable? How do we deliver value over a long period of time? How do we keep up with velocity over a long period of time? But also, how do we measure success? How do we know we're doing a good job or not? And how do we measure the impact of changes to our delivery chain? So I've changed my own mindset. The way I think about visibility now in application development environments is both in depth and breadth. Now, the depth part of it, we have pretty well. Like the concepts around observability, sure, there's still a lot of challenges when figuring out how to deal with distributed systems and creating visibility for them. But it's also largely understood what you can do. We also are pretty good at incident response and on-call, and especially if your organization has implemented the SRE practice, you probably have that pretty dialed in, and there's always room for improvement. All of this is a journey. So what happens in production, the depth part of this, we're doing pretty good at. In the areas that there's a lot of growth besides iterating on observability and on-call is in better collaboration with security and DevSecOps. What we have been neglecting is the breadth. And that is your pipeline, what happens in your delivery chain. And true code to cloud visibility. So understanding what happens from the point that a feature is defined to what happens when that feature is running in production has to include both of these, and not just the coverage, if you think it from a visibility coverage, but the relationship between all of these elements. And what we find in organizations, and you might be saying to yourself, we are really good at using Prometheus to visualize X, Y, Z. You do find pockets of visibility in enterprises that is very, very good. For example, developers tend to be very good at visualizing dev test environments and what's happening there. And DevOps engineers tend to be very good at visualizing maybe what's going on with their pipelines and what happens to the tooling and how it's being used and so forth. But these silos become as problematic as they are good at their particular job. They're very fine-tuned at one job. What happens is that developers are speaking one language, DevOps engineers are speaking one language, security professionals are speaking one language. Why does that matter to the developer? You may think, well, that's just fine. I want to be really good at my job. I don't really care what happens once it's thrown over the fence. Well, security professionals can be very disruptive, and they can make you stop everything just to have you explain how you do what you do. So wouldn't it be great if you never have to stop and you can just point them in the right direction, a dashboard of some sort, to get the information they need so that you can continue to build functionality? That's why these visibility silos are bad, because your security professional is not going to understand what's going on in your Prometheus dashboards. They're just not. You're going to have to explain every time. And I think in the development space, we like to refer to that as shaving the yak, which is one of those terms that I've never really understood. So if somebody out there understands exactly where they came from, please tell me. So this is how we get to why pipeline analytics. Why are we doing this? Well, first of all, if your delivery chain is down, no code ships. So your customers are your developers, your DevOps engineers, everybody in the engineering org. And if your delivery chain shuts down, you can't deliver code. That is the service that you're providing. Also, we know now, and I don't even have to prove this point anymore because it's been in the news so much, that your delivery chain is a part of your attack surface. So when it comes to security, we talk about the SolarWinds hack. Your software delivery chain is a part of your enterprise's attack surface. There's risk associated with that. People getting access to your repositories, finding out that you're pulling artifacts from a public repo. As you can see, my cat has become the clingiest cat in the world recently. Also, I already talked about speaking the same language. That is a big reason why we do this. Measuring business value. So have you ever have a hard time justifying to your manager a tool that you would like to buy? Part of that justification is being able to demonstrate business value. And yes, as you grow in your career, and maybe you're already there, engineering, you also have to speak business speak. So being able to correlate what you do in your delivery chain to success, failure, business value is a big deal. The other two categories, which are not as obvious, is this is also a way to help reduce technical debt before it becomes technical debt and support shift left, which is obviously something that we all talk about. It's all about creating that framework and paving that road to make sure that the application velocity and the automation you write is sustainable over a long period of time. So now I'm really going to dig into what the components are of pipeline analytics. Some of these are more fun than others. It depends on choose your poison. I think the one that people get the most excited about, and we'll probably double click on and why it's at the end, is the measuring success, the KPIs. But there's other value here. And these three use cases tend to be how you structure your pipeline analytics tooling. So first is just monitoring your software delivery chain, just like you monitor your applications. Is my secrets management tool up? Is my CI/CD tool up and responsive and running? With secrets, are the lease times on the turnaround time, the SLI for returning a secret, is it fast enough? Also, measuring value, creating value stream, being able to tell people that you just invested a whole bunch of money in observability and it has reduced your MTTR. And the one that tends to be the most boring is auditing and security. Being able to have a real-time stream of audit data such that you don't have to compile this data manually at some point in time, because that is very disruptive, takes a lot of time. If you're in a large enterprise and you've ever had to do that, it's not fun. So how do you do this? Well, the other thing that's kind of frustrating of why enterprises aren't always already doing this is it's not that hard, and you may not even have to procure a new tool to do it. So you're gathering metrics and logs from the tools in your tool chain, not just the tools themselves, but also the processes. So the automation that you run, because some of that automation may not be directly associated with the tool. You find that your CI/CD tool tends to be the low-hanging fruit. Not the only one, but low-hanging fruit. And I'm going to discuss that in a second. Once you have the data, you need to correlate that data across tools and teams. So understanding from your ticketing system how that relates to your repository, how that relates to your CI/CD jobs. And then you observe. It's another practice of observability, really, but it's being applied to your delivery chain and not just your application in production. The two primary gotchas, and this is 95% of every scenario I run into with enterprises implementing pipeline analytics. These are the two things that are always present. And it could be both. And so the two key challenges, and thus the two key areas that enterprises need to think about, is data resolution and tool sprawl. Data resolution. What do I mean by that? Well, metrics are different than logs, right? Metrics are a synthesized version. The data is probably coming from a log, but it's synthesized data points, things you want to measure over a time series. So it's extremely valuable. You can do a lot with metrics, but it doesn't have a lot of verbosity and data to dig into in the future. What are other elements of data resolution? Well, when you commit your code, are you including the ticket number from your ticketing system? If not, I don't have the ability to correlate the two together. So what you find in pipeline analytics is you have to make decisions around this, because data anymore, and we actually see it trending further away from logs, but the most verbose, most amount of information you can get from your tools in your tool chain are logs. Two, probably the least amount of information, but very clean, very efficient, real time, is webhooks. And so you have that entire spectrum. Some of your tools may have logs and not webhooks. Other tools you may only be able to get data and events from them from webhooks and not logs. So you actually have to decide early on with your tools the type of data you're going to get, how you're going to correlate that data together. Also, when it comes to data resolution, the more tools you correlate together, the better resolution you have. So I will give you an example. I can calculate change failure rate in 3 different ways. I can calculate it from my CI/CD tool related to rollbacks. I can calculate it from my incident management, incident response tool based on incidents or ticket open and ticket close state. I can calculate it from my ticketing system with bugs open close date. The least accurate of all of those is your backlog, because there's a lot of different reasons that our bugs are filed in a backlog. The most accurate is actually, well, maybe you could argue against this, but for most people, the most accurate is going to be your incident response tooling, assuming that you have a really strong incident response strategy. And then middle of the road is going to be your CI/CD tool. Any one of those are a way to calculate change failure rate. However, your accuracy is going to increase as you correlate the 3 together. So that's another element of data resolution. These are all not technology problems. These are all things that the organization has to consider on their own. The next thing is tool sprawl. Speaking of tools, large companies have nearly every tool out there, and all of those tools produce data. And there's a tendency to say that we are going to consolidate on one tool, which would be amazing. That is, I think, the overall goal. This is certainly how I advise our customers the path they need to go. What companies want, that I break so many hearts on, is they want just to be agnostic of the tool and just say, it doesn't matter the tool, just get the data in, and once the data's in, we're going to be able to make value from it. You run into a lot of issues with that. You have apples to oranges problems where the way one tool reports job start, job end is different than another tool. And reconciling those becomes very difficult. So tool sprawl is a problem. So is tool fatigue. I'm sure we've all felt that. In our industry, we have a tendency to become very tool obsessed due to the nature of being builders and tinkerers. but it can cause problems. And so tool consolidation is a noble effort. And you can actually use pipeline analytics as a way to enforce tool consolidation by demonstrating value on a very focused tool. And I could talk about that a lot, but I'm going to move on to the next step. So let's find out how we execute on these three primary use cases. I'm going to start with monitor, go into audit, and then measure we'll finish with, because that is the most fun in my opinion. So monitoring, no different than what you do today with your applications in production. Is your CI/CD tool running? Is your artifact management tool running? If it's running, is it tapped out? Is it performant? And you can actually use standard red metrics or golden signals from a infrastructure standpoint to oftentimes determine if this is happening. If you're using a SaaS-based repository tool, your considerations change and it becomes much simpler. It's all around availability and response. But if you're running a secrets management tool on-prem, then it's basically your standard infrastructure metrics, which makes it very nice and easy to do. Usually what you see organizations do is create a dashboard just for monitoring, and it's usually owned by the DevOps team, sometimes SREs. Auditing and DevSecOps. So this is checking things like in your secrets management tool, are people generating secrets for root access? That shouldn't be allowed, probably ever. That should never happen. So if that is happening, you want to know about it. Are you getting secrets lease requests from outside the US, outside your firewall or your what's the proper networking term here? We'll just say your network. And how many of those are you getting? So these are all making sure that you don't have bad actors accessing your tools in your tool chain, but also if the audit and compliance department comes down to you, you don't have to stop everything for 2 weeks. You can show them a dashboard and say, here's your audit trail. This is how we do what we do. Here's the information. Let me know if you have any questions, versus stopping everything and stop building functionality. So it's certainly fun not to be disruptive. That's one of the reasons you do this. Again, this tends to be its own dashboard that is delivered to the rest of the organization. Now let's get to the fun part, which is the metrics, knowing the value of good. This is where customers that I've worked with gets really, really excited on what is possible. The first thing you have to decide is, what are you going to measure? There are so many metrics you can measure and so many reasons to do that. Once you've decided what you're going to measure, you have to figure out how you're going to measure it. So I gave you the example of change failure rate and the various ways you can measure it. Some of it's based on having the data. And if you don't have the data, you need to try to get the data. If you do have the data, is it high enough resolution to answer the questions you want to answer? Those two things have to happen every single time. And this is why, unfortunately, it's not turnkey. So nearly every company I've dealt with, there is a different format and way of dealing with this. And unfortunately, it comes so often down to how projects and repos and teams are named. It is such a simple thing, naming conventions, but that tends to be the problematic factor in almost all the time. So there is this thing out there called the DORA metrics, and Tracy mentioned this. DORA was a research institute that was at some point acquired by Google and releases the amazing annual report on DevOps. And as a result of all their research, they came up with 4 key metrics around measuring your delivery chain. It's great. It comes up in conversations a lot. But the reason it's great is because it's forcing people to think about pipeline analytics. It is not a catch-all and end-all. And it certainly is not for modern applications in continuous delivery, canary releases, etc., because it misses a lot of elements that you're not going to be able it's just not going to deliver the same value. And there may be other things that you should be measuring instead of this. So it's very similar to what Google did with golden signals. It's very similar to what we see with red metrics, that they're a good starting point. But you're not done just because you implement these, and they may not be where you need to start. They may not be all of the metrics you need to create. And there's other out there that I'm actually really interested in. There's flow metrics, for example. There is, I really like works in progress. I really like the calculations of unplanned work. These are a lot of things that are happening in production. But I also have seen organizations look at this from the perspective of they have way too many branches out there, way too many repos out there, and they don't even understand what's being used, what's not being used. So they build analytics around aging summaries around their repos and branches, and are able to do something really meaningful there. Most of the time, you can pick one metric that is tremendously high impact. And once you have that and you share that with the rest of the organization, usually driven by the DevOps team, you just open up the world of possibilities, start to get requests and fine tune. Now, what I was saying that Tracy really made me think about in modern applications is that, well, you can't just think about like just deployments as like chunks that move. It's a stream of consciousness, and we're dealing with infrastructure that is stateless and ephemeral. And there's a lot of things that are going on with deployments where we're doing blue, green, red, black, chaos engineering, canary releases, like all this crazy stuff that I haven't fully wrapped my brain around yet. And in those scenarios, the types of metrics you might be interested could be around feature flags, could be around rollbacks, could be around, amount of load that you have on any individual service and version of that service out in the wild. So it certainly changes, because mean time to value is not going to be the same when you're doing blue-green deploys as it is for an organization where the version that's in production is the version that's in production. So it becomes very fascinating. And the reason that this is so important, and I want to highlight that, is the fact that you have to think about this. You can't, and this is true for everything, you can't just expect an on-call tool to make an incident response strategy for you. You can't just expect pipeline analytics tooling to solve the metric question for you. That's a question that you have to answer. It can't fix your team naming conventions. It can't fix your project naming conventions. Now, one of the things that we suggest is establishing a common information model. And as a matter of fact, I'm working on that. I would love for that to be an open source project that eventually becomes a part of the CD Foundation. But you need to establish these upfront, even prior to thinking about implementation. Good news is there's best practices. There's a lot of guidance out there. Happy to talk about that with you if you're interested. So going back to the initial point and the punchline, your software delivery chain is an application of applications. Because of that, you need to treat it like an application. It needs to be operable, auditable, and measurable. The measurement is the most fun. And that's what pipeline analytics does for you. Pipeline analytics is the foundation of DevSecOps. It's the foundation of a lot of things. And there's so much creativity you can get here, some good, some bad. One of the things I want to put out there, leaderboards. Leaderboards are really fun, but they're also very dangerous. So if you're thinking that you want to pin your engineering teams against each other, you need to really consider that, because that can also backfire. So pipeline analytics is something that everybody should embrace. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me. I know there's a lot of information out there. And so I respect the fact that anybody who's dedicating half an hour of their time on one of my sessions is being very nice to me. If you want to reach out, again, there's the QR code, and let's talk. Let's open it up for conversation.
Chris, thank you. That was, I think that your beginning statement and your end statement is probably one of the most important takeaways. How often do we think of our pipeline as an application itself? And you have brought back the word or the acronym SDLC. Software
They
development
go away.
lifecycle. It didn't go away. It just we started calling it a DevOps pipeline, but in essence, it's an SDLC pipeline, right? It's how
Amazing.
do we automate and make a factory-like process of getting code from point one to to the endpoint, and then do the metrics around it. So thank you for pointing that out, because it is kind of a
Oh,
critical part of the puzzle, is that we have to think about our our pipeline as an application. So everybody who is still on, you do have, you can unmute yourself. You can ask any kind of questions. I am going to kick off the questions. It's probably going to be a hard one. Maybe it'll just lead to discussion. So when we move to microservices, and microservices are all independently deployed, have you thought about the analytics that we need to start tracking on a microservice? So for example, at Ortelius and DeployHub, we're thinking about this stuff in terms of risk value and usage. So you push a microservice out there, but nobody's consuming it. Was there a value of doing? What's the value of it being out there? So have you thought
mhm.
about that?
Yeah, and you're right. It's a very hard question because the easy response is a cop out, and that cop out is you don't look at it at a service level. You roll it up to a broader level. But I think looking at it at a service level is absolutely critical. What we found with organizations is that the drill down has been very problematic, and so what tends to happen is companies look at this from an engineering team perspective and not a service perspective. And I think that that's a big mistake for all the reasons that you mentioned, is because if I have blue green, I may have two versions of the same service or more out there in the wild. And the true value of running that type of deployment process is being able to know what happened, if it broke, and how is it being leveraged. Latency, everything. For example, some organizations, if you do your rollouts like as percentages of user bases, you may have tested your application. So at the 25, let's say for simple purposes, you're rolling out an application to 100 users and you start with 25% of the population. All looks good. 50% of the population looking great. But to make the decision at 50% to turn the whole thing on, when maybe at 75%, everything explodes because of latency and performance that you never even anticipated and never saw. So those are the reasons you do this type of deployment strategy. So if you're not visualizing and building dashboards on that, you're missing out on that granularity and opportunity. I don't think that it's a technical challenge. I think that all of the data is there, especially if you have good observability tooling in APM. But I don't think organizations have yet thought through, that I've seen, how they're going to make value from that. So I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, exactly. So that, we talk about DORA metrics, and deployment frequency is one of the metrics. Do we even use that anymore in an independently deployed microservice
Right.
environment where you're deploying all the time?
Yeah. Yeah. And it becomes difficult. So one of the things that like our SRE team, the way they've done it, and I think that it probably would be similar, is that at the entire application level, they have metrics. They are responsible for owning and defining those metrics. At the service level, they are responsible for making available the metrics, the standard red metrics. Once you double click and you become a service owner, you're interested in stuff that other people on the team are going to have no clue about. And it depends whether, and this is the other thing I wanted to say, it depends on the risk level is very interesting. If it's a front end, it may have less risk than if it's back end. You're pushing changes to your back end, it's probably more risk than you're pushing changes to a front end. So at the service level, our service owners own their metrics. I wonder if you can do the same thing with pipeline analytics. You still allow the capabilities at the service level, but the service owner is the one who owns those metrics. The downside of that, though, is that part of this is demonstrating value to the entire organization. So a lot of times you get into this really hard decision-making process of where you have to say, we want these 15 metrics for everybody. We hope and believe that that is possible, but we're going to have to settle for maybe even one and maybe even three. Because yeah, you can't in a microservices environment. It's misleading to say that our entire application is doing well when you have one critical service that is not performing well at all over like has a tremendously high change failure rate.
So if you want to ask questions and you want to type it into the QA chat, I will be happy to pose them if you don't want to ask them directly. Another kind of thing that I think about this stuff oftentimes, I don't know where my brain goes sometimes, but when we start thinking about the pipeline and we think about maturing the pipeline, I always feel like the maturity of the pipeline itself should be part of our pipeline metrics. We're going to start seeing infrastructure as code be part of the pipeline. Mm-hmm. I think that we're going to start thinking about the application and having many components. Components might be microservice, might be database updates, but it might be the infrastructure itself.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, a lot of organizations that is one of the starting point is their recipes and their, Puppet and Chef and Terraform. Terraform is one of the most common tools to be monitored in pipeline analytics. And I think you see that a lot. And maybe part of it is an artifact that the DevOps team tends to have more control of what they own. And so it's easier for them to do that. But I think you're right. Everything needs to be abstracted to this idea that it's all code. It's all software. I am trying to automate as much as I can possibly automate, and including, maybe not bare metal. I know we talked about this would be really interesting from the perspective of mainframes, but it's all code. It's all software. It all has telemetry. We need to make value from that. And I think actually you find that that's easier to do than what we were talking about with microservices. It tends to be a little bit easier.
Yeah, if you're doing infrastructure as code and you're always spinning up a new environment, you're kind of always at day one, right?
That's true. Yeah.
And then you tear it down and you spin up a whole new environment for a new release. But when we talk about things like that, I feel like we are still thinking about our monolithic practices, and we're not really trying to think of a service-oriented architecture. So as we go down this road, we have to really start asking the question about what is a service-oriented architecture? What does it add to the pipeline, or what does it take away? And how are we going to measure if we're doing it well? And even in a standard monolithic, I mean, most companies that we talk to, they struggle with doing a repeatable process through the full SDLC. They have a different tool at production that they do that the developers have when they're doing deployments, for example. And I think that can impact how we measure analytics as well, because now we have different logging tools to try to pull data from, and it represents different information.
Yeah. And then the exercise you're going through right now is exactly what companies don't do. And more than once I've run into a company where they're like, okay, we set up observability, we set up incident response, we have all this great stuff going on. Now we want to decide how we're going to measure it, versus saying, before we get our incident response tool, before we get our observability tool, let's decide what is the meaning of good. How do we know that by deploying these things, we are doing better? And I think that is true with everything, because like you said, I mean, serverless functions, get away from infrastructure, like the up and down of serverless functions, that happens in a blink of an eye. Well, maybe not quite a blink of an eye, but it's very quickly, but it matters to the value of your delivery chain. So that exercise is the exercise that is the most frustrating, because everybody wants an easy button. I get it. But it's an exercise that people are just not doing.
Yeah, we all want an easy button, right? I can't even tell you how many times in being in the build and deploy space, people have asked me, can't you just hit a button? It's like, well, software's not psychic yet.
Right,
So,
exactly. I mean, once we get to that point, then are we really going to have developers at all? I
yeah.
don't think that's in the near future, but there's a lot of philosophical fun conversations to be had about that.
Yeah, and that will be an interesting day. And, SOA kind of pushes that, right? Because if you really build a foundation of reusable services, everybody's just building their front end.
Yep, exactly.
And yes, there was a question out there if this will be recorded. It is recorded, and after this, I will produce it, and it will be posted in the CD Foundation's online meetup playlist. So you can go to the YouTube account or the YouTube channel for the CD Foundation and look for the online meetup, and it will be posted here, probably in the next 24 hours or less.
Oh, that's fast.
I try to get it up there as quickly as possible.
I know it's
Otherwise,
one of those things like there's a shelf life to edit videos that need Zoom videos that needed to be moved somewhere. I've learned that myself with the podcast.
yeah, you got to do it immediately. Otherwise, I'll totally forget. Well, Chris, this has been enlightening. I really appreciate you
Thank
joining
you.
the CD Foundation online meetup to present these topics. We are having these conversations at the CD Foundation. We have a working group that's all about best practices that we're discussing. We have a working group around events. The interoperability team is starting to take on policies, and these are all and in their essence what we start building those pipeline analytics on, and giving us a way to think about it has been super helpful.
Great. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Hey everybody, we'll see you next month again. Steve Tarana talking about the Jenkins templating engine. I think it'll be a fun talk as well. Thank you.
Tracy. Yep. Have a good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
100%, our pleasure.